Hey, I'm Nathan Cole, and welcome to Fatal Files. Today, I've gathered some of the most shocking deaths caused by eating challenges, from a man whose final mistake was trying a rare imported delicacy to a celebration that turned into a nightmare when a roasted boar erupted into flames. It was October 17, 2015, and guests were arriving at a secluded California estate overlooking the Pacific Ocean for an exclusive private dinner hosted by a billionaire. The property buzzed with anticipation as staff prepared to serve a rare delicacy few people had ever tasted before. Curtis Etheridge was 41 years old and had built a fortune through a series of successful business ventures, eventually becoming a billionaire. Despite his wealth, he remained heavily involved in organizing the private events hosted at his estate and took a personal interest in every detail. Meticulous and highly organized by nature, he preferred staying involved in the planning process rather than leaving everything to staff. I've always found it interesting how some people stay heavily involved in the details even after becoming enormously successful. Most would hand everything off to staff, but not Curtis. The dinner had taken months to arrange. The featured ingredient had been sourced from overseas and transported through multiple distribution points before arriving in California. Its rarity was part of the attraction, and many guests had attended specifically for the chance to try it. While guests enjoyed cocktails and conversation overlooking the ocean, Curtis spent most of the evening moving throughout the estate, checking on preparations, speaking with staff, and handling last-minute issues. By the time the final course arrived, shortly after 9 p.m., most of his responsibilities for the evening were finally behind him. For the first time all night, Curtis sat down and joined several guests in tasting the featured dish. The atmosphere remained relaxed as conversations continued and waves crashed against the cliffs below. After hours of overseeing the event and making sure everything ran smoothly, I imagine that moment felt like a well-earned break. Nearly 40 minutes later, Curtis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Sweat began forming across his forehead, and his face became noticeably flushed despite the cool evening air. Curtis quietly excused himself from the table and started walking toward a hallway connecting the dining pavilion to the main residence. He had only covered about 20 feet when his pace noticeably slowed. One hand pressed against his abdomen as he paused beside a wall, appearing to steady himself before continuing. A short time later, his condition took a sudden turn for the worse. He stumbled forward and nearly lost his footing before staff members rushed toward him. Severe nausea quickly overwhelmed him, forcing him to one knee as concerned guests moved away from the table and staff cleared space around him. What had been a relaxed and celebratory atmosphere only minutes earlier suddenly turned tense and confused as concern began replacing the excitement of the evening. Over the next several minutes, Curtis became visibly weaker. The color drained from his face. His breathing grew increasingly rapid, and he struggled to answer simple questions from those attempting to help him. Emergency assistance was called immediately, but the estate's remote location several miles from town created an unavoidable delay. Hidden behind private roads and difficult to access after dark, the property wasn't somewhere responders could reach quickly. While everyone waited for help to arrive, Curtis's condition continued to worsen. Staff members stayed beside him and tried to keep him conscious, but he became increasingly unresponsive. By the time responders reached the estate nearly half an hour later, he was in critical condition. Curtis was transported for treatment, but despite continued medical efforts, he died later that night. Investigators later determined that the featured dish contained imported fermented fish that had been exposed to temperature fluctuations during transport. Laboratory testing identified elevated levels of botulinum toxin, a dangerous neurotoxin that can develop in improperly stored food. While several guests sampled small portions, Curtis consumed a larger serving after spending much of the evening overseeing the event. Testing also revealed uneven toxin distribution, with the portion served to Curtis containing some of the highest levels detected. The final report concluded that Curtis died from acute botulinum toxin poisoning after consuming the contaminated seafood. Investigators determined that improper handling during transportation played a significant role in the tragedy, and the death was ruled accidental. It was August 3, 2016, at a night market in Penang, Malaysia. Warm air hung heavy with fruit, sugar, and diesel. Fluorescent bulbs hummed above plastic tables, vendors shouted promotions, crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, and phones stayed raised as food changed hands beneath canvas tarps throughout the narrow lanes. Most people at the Penang port recognized Ahmad Ismail, 41, by his voice before his face. He worked long shifts coordinating cargo amid engine noise and heat, relying on stamina rather than routine medical care. He rarely missed a workday and measured his health by whether he could stay on his feet through each shift. Checkups were often postponed, and flagged blood pressure readings were treated as inconveniences rather than warnings. He rarely drank alcohol and often bragged about tolerating heavy food without trouble. Co-workers knew he sweated easily and kept headache tablets in his pocket. Mandatory health screenings flagged high blood pressure more than once, but he signed the forms and returned to the loading bays. Records later showed repeated elevated readings above 160 systolic. That evening, a night fruit market advertised an eat-all-you-can durian promotion for $5, framed as harmless endurance fun. Customers were encouraged to participate openly. Ahmad stepped forward willingly. Durian is calorie-dense, high in natural sugars and fats, and places acute strain on digestion and circulation when consumed rapidly. Over the course of about 25 minutes, he consumed nearly 6 fruits that weighed almost 8 pounds. His hands grew slick, his shirt darkened with sweat, and his breathing became heavy. The stall owner recorded him beforehand for promotional purposes. To cut the taste, Ahmad grabbed a 20-ounce cola and drank it quickly, laughing as he finished. No staff intervened. There were no posted warnings about moderation. Ambient temperatures were above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the crowd tight, and excess was rewarded with attention. Ahmad wiped his face repeatedly, but waved off concern from nearby customers. Confidence carried the moment, and the atmosphere stayed casual. Minutes later, his posture changed. His expression tightened and his movements slowed. As he attempted to stand, his body hesitated mid-motion. His right arm dropped and the left side of his face slackened. He tried to respond to someone nearby but could not form words. He collapsed backward into stacked crates and fell to the ground. His legs stiffened briefly, then went loose. Emergency services were called immediately. The camera captured the moment he went down, showing loss of balance, followed by collapse, but no one recognized the severity of what was happening at first. His breathing became irregular and shallow. Saliva and airway fluid pooled at his mouth rather than foam from the lungs. His skin flushed, then dulled. Confusion filled the space where urgency should have been as the market noise continued around him. Within minutes, his chest stopped rising, his jaw loosened, and his body went still. Paramedics arrived shortly after, but Ahmad was already unresponsive. Attempts to revive him failed. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner determined the cause was a massive brain bleed caused by uncontrolled high blood pressure. Rapid sugar intake, caffeine, heat, and physical strain triggered a sudden spike, rupturing a vessel deep in the brain. Blood flooded areas, controlling breathing and movement, causing immediate and irreversible damage. Years of untreated hypertension had thickened his arteries, and a distended stomach from fruit and soda increased internal pressure. Death followed within minutes, beyond the reach of medical intervention. Authorities ordered the stall closed and banned unlimited durian promotions across the market. The recordings were removed after public backlash. Inspectors cited failure to manage crowd safety and health risk awareness. His death became an internal case study on ignored health risks, documented quietly and filed away. It was October 21st, 2017, and volunteers filled a community center in Omaha preparing for an annual church fundraiser. Inside the large multi-purpose room, long folding tables were set up with supplies for making caramel apples. Industrial pots sat on portable burners, boxes of fresh apples waited nearby, and volunteers moved between stations organizing sticks, wrappers, and toppings. Caldor Thump, a 33-year-old maintenance worker at a local educational facility, had volunteered to help with the candy-making process. He was known among co-workers and church members as friendly and easygoing. someone who showed up when help was needed and kept the mood light with casual jokes. He had arrived early to assist with setup and had been stirring one of the large pots of caramel for nearly 20 minutes. The mixture had been cooking on high heat and had just been removed from the burner to cool slightly before dipping began. Steam rose from the surface of the thick, amber liquid. As Caldor stood near the pot, another volunteer mentioned the caramel needed to be tested for consistency. Without much thought, he grabbed a metal spoon and dipped it into the pot, scooping up a generous amount of molten sugar. Several people nearby watched casually, some holding their phones to document the preparation. Caldor lifted the spoon toward his mouth, joking about being the official taste tester. He placed the spoon directly into his mouth before anyone could warn him about the temperature. The superheated caramel touched his tongue and the roof of his mouth instantly. The thick sugar clung to the tissue and continued burning at temperatures well above 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Caldor's expression changed at once. He dropped the spoon and it clattered onto the floor. His hands flew to his face as he made a strangled sound. The caramel stuck inside his mouth and throat, impossible to spit out. He bent forward, gagging violently, but the substance remained adhered to the tissue. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Caldor stumbled backward, bumping into a chair. His breathing grew strained and raspy as the burns triggered rapid swelling in his throat. He inhaled sharply in reflex and likely aspirated small amounts, worsening airway swelling and irritation. Panic spread as he struggled to pull in air through the tightening passage. His coughs weakened, replaced by shallow, desperate breaths. Volunteers rushed to help. Someone called emergency services while others tried to give him water, but he couldn't swallow. His face flushed, then slowly darkened as oxygen levels fell. Caldor dropped to his knees, clutching his throat. His breathing faded into faint wheezes and uneven gasps before he collapsed onto his side on the linoleum floor, still barely breathing but unresponsive. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. They found Caldor unconscious with severe oral burns and clear airway distress. Oxygen was administered immediately as they stabilized him for transport. Swelling and damaged tissue made airway management difficult. They were able to support his breathing and rushed him to a nearby hospital, where emergency physicians continued aggressive treatment to control swelling and secure the airway. Over the next several hours, Caldor's condition deteriorated despite intensive care. Progressive airway swelling, combined with aspiration injury and respiratory failure, placed increasing strain on his lungs. Doctors attempted advanced interventions, but complications from the thermal burns continued to worsen. He was pronounced dead later that night, hours after the initial injury. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as respiratory failure due to severe thermal burns of the oral cavity and upper airway, with aspiration contributing to the fatal outcome. Findings confirmed extensive tissue damage consistent with ingestion of superheated caramel, estimated between 320 and 340 degrees Fahrenheit at contact. Authorities ruled the incident an accidental death during food preparation. The fundraiser was canceled immediately, and the community center closed for the evening while investigators documented the scene. It was September 3, 2015, in a wooded residential area outside Eugene, Oregon, where several days of rain had left the ground damp across the surrounding properties. Homes were spaced along gravel driveways and bordered by dense forest common to the region. Doxley Vant, a 42-year-old freelance photographer, lived in one of these homes tucked back from the main road. He had spent the better part of a decade documenting wildlife and native plants throughout the Pacific Northwest, often spending long hours alone in wooded areas with a camera and field journal. He was meticulous about his equipment, but more casual in identifying flora, often relying on visual comparison rather than formal training. His backyard bordered a dense patch of second-growth forest, and he frequently walked the property looking for photographic subjects. That afternoon, clusters of wrinkled reddish-brown mushrooms with folded, brain-like caps had emerged in the shaded soil just beyond his back fence, roughly 15 feet from the tree line. The caps were irregular and deeply lobed rather than smooth, measuring between 2 and 3 inches across. Doxley noticed them while carrying his tripod back and decided they resembled morel mushrooms shown in one of his older field guides. He crouched down briefly, then began pulling them from the soil by hand. He collected several handfuls and placed them into a grocery bag before rinsing them under cold water. By early evening, he had set up a propane burner on the back patio and began preparing a stew using venison scraps from a recent hunt, along with diced onions, potatoes, and the mushrooms he had gathered earlier. Two neighbors stopped by while the stew was heating. They spoke briefly about the rain and the condition of the gravel road. Doxley mentioned the mushrooms growing behind the fence. The neighbors asked if he was certain they were safe, and he replied that they looked identical to the ones in his book. After they left, Doxley served himself a bowl containing several pieces of the mushrooms, along with venison and potato. He ate alone on the patio as the light faded. The meal tasted normal, and he finished without concern, then spent another hour reviewing photographs on his camera screen. Nearly 6 hours later, shortly before midnight, Doxley woke suddenly on the couch inside the house. A violent wave of nausea forced him to the bathroom, where he began vomiting repeatedly. His hands trembled, and a pounding headache spread behind his eyes. Severe abdominal cramps and heavy sweating followed within minutes. He attempted to stand and reach his phone, but his coordination rapidly deteriorated. His speech became slurred, and his vision distorted. Moments later, his body stiffened, and he collapsed as a seizure began, striking the hallway wall before falling to the floor. The convulsions lasted several seconds before stopping, leaving him barely conscious. One of the neighbors returned about 30 minutes later to drop off a borrowed handsaw and noticed the lights still on and the front door partly open. When the neighbor stepped inside, he found Doxley lying on the hallway floor, breathing irregularly and barely responsive. Emergency services were called immediately. Responders transported Doxley to a hospital where toxicology tests were initiated. His neurological condition worsened quickly. Medical staff administered activated charcoal, anticonvulsant medication, and intravenous fluids, but the toxins had already begun damaging multiple organs. Over the following day, his liver function deteriorated rapidly, and despite intensive treatment, he died roughly 30 hours after the first symptoms began. The remaining stew was still sitting in the pot on the burner, and investigators collected samples along with additional mushrooms from behind the fence. Laboratory analysis identified the species as false morels belonging to the genus Gyromitra, mushrooms that contain the toxin gyrometrin. When metabolized, the compound can cause severe vomiting, seizures, neurological collapse, and liver damage within hours of ingestion. The species is notorious for being mistaken by inexperienced foragers for edible morels. The death was documented as accidental poisoning caused by the consumption of misidentified wild mushrooms. It was August 11, 2015, in a crowded night market in Singapore, where one dessert stall kept pulling people in with cold fog spilling out of paper cups. From a distance, it looked like a harmless trick. Up close, it looked like something fun, something people lined up for without thinking twice. Earlier that night, Kyle Mercer was 19. School break, walking through the market with his older cousin and a few friends. They had been moving from stall to stall, trying different street foods, picking whatever locals pointed out or what drew a crowd. Kyle stayed near the front of the group most of the time. People with him later said he usually stepped in first when something got attention. By the time they reached the stall, he had already taken that role. He tried things before the others, especially if people nearby were reacting to it. The cups with vapor spilling over the sides drew a crowd, and several people were laughing after trying them. Kyle stepped forward while the others watched from behind. The snack itself was simple. Cereal is served cold enough to create visible fog when you exhale. The vendor explained how to eat it while serving. People nearby heard it. It wasn't hidden, and nothing about it seemed complicated. Kyle finished the cereal right at the counter. At the bottom of the cup, there was still a small amount of liquid, still bubbling and giving off vapor. People around him noticed. One person gestured for him to stop. Another told him to leave it. And this is the part that always stands out. He had time to set it down. Nothing was forcing him to keep going. Instead, he held the cup a second longer, looked around, and then tilted it. The reaction was immediate. As soon as he swallowed, he jerked forward, one hand going straight to his stomach. His posture tightened, and the expression on his face changed instantly. The joking stopped right away. From that point, the situation escalated quickly. Witnesses said he took a few unsteady steps before dropping to his knees. He couldn't stand straight. He started gasping, not because he couldn't breathe, but because the pain hit fast and hard. His body tightened, and he curled forward, trying to hold himself together. People nearby moved back, unsure what they were seeing at first. He collapsed onto the ground within seconds, turning onto his side and then going still. A vendor from the next stall called for help, while others cleared space and checked if he was breathing. The crowd shifted quickly from watching something entertaining to backing away from something they didn't understand. Emergency services arrived within several minutes, but by then he was already unconscious and in severe shock. The investigation later focused on what was left in the cup. It was confirmed that a small amount of extremely cold liquid remained after the cereal was finished. When it entered the body, it changed rapidly and built up pressure inside the stomach faster than it could be released. The post-mortem findings were clear. The stomach had ruptured under that pressure. In simple terms, the contents inside expanded so quickly that the stomach could not hold it, and it tore open. Once that happened, the body went into rapid shock and could not recover. Authorities shut the stall down temporarily and later enforced stricter serving rules so no residual liquid could remain in cups. Witness statements confirmed that a warning had been given before the incident, but it wasn't taken seriously at the time. It was June 18, 2016, in Port Cressida along the Croatian coast, and the evening air still held the warmth of the day. The harbor was calm, with lights reflecting off the water, and the main plaza was filling up fast. Music, conversation, glasses clinking. It felt like a normal summer festival. Elena Varga, 29 years old, is an assistant teacher who doesn't usually go out much. What I found in this case, she's an introvert and always prefers staying at home to going to crowded places, but her sister convinced her to come. Nothing big, just a local festival, something to get her out again. That night, the main attraction was a new kind of wine made using algae harvested from a nearby lagoon. The local winemaker had experimented with small homemade batches before, usually shared only among friends or a few regular customers. Nobody had reported serious problems, so confidence around the drink slowly grew. And this is usually how risky food trends spread. Nothing bad happens the first few times, so people stop treating it like an experiment. At the festival, organizers were promoting the wine as a unique local specialty. Large barrels had been prepared days earlier, but unlike commercial alcohol production, no formal toxin testing was done before serving it publicly. By sunset, the plaza was packed. Around 200 people lined up to try the drink as crowds filled the narrow spaces between tables and food stalls. Some noticed the wine tasted slightly salty or earthy. Nobody seemed concerned at first. Then, the first reactions started. A few guests mentioned a tingling feeling around their lips. Others laughed about their fingers feeling numb, assuming the wine was simply stronger than expected. But within 15 to 20 minutes, the symptoms became harder to ignore. People started losing coordination. One man dropped his glass while trying to stand, while another stumbled into a table and sat back down. Conversations slowed as people struggled to speak clearly, and several attendees later said their arms and legs suddenly felt delayed or disconnected. Elena was near one of the center tables when it hit her. Her sister later said Elena placed a hand against the table to steady herself before her knees suddenly gave out and she collapsed onto the pavement. Around her, more people started falling one by one. A woman near the wine station could no longer grip her cup. An older man stumbled into a bench after losing control of his legs. Others bumped into tables and chairs trying to move as their coordination failed in real time. That's when panic started spreading. Many people didn't realize the wine was causing it. Some thought there had been a gas leak or some kind of accident near the stage, so people pushed toward the exits while victims were already collapsed along the narrow walkways. That confusion probably made everything feel even more terrifying, because people were trying to escape something they couldn't even see yet, while the real danger was already affecting their bodies. But the crowd itself wasn't the main killer. It mostly made escape harder, while the toxin continued shutting down people's nervous systems. Some victims were too weak to move out of the way, while others remained collapsed where they fell, struggling to breathe as the neurotoxin spread further through their bodies. Within minutes, the plaza was filled with people either unconscious, vomiting, struggling to move, or trying desperately to help relatives who suddenly couldn't stand anymore. Emergency crews found victims scattered across the plaza. Some had injuries from falls during the panic, but doctors quickly realized the bigger problem was neurological. Patients struggled to speak, move, and eventually breathe properly. Elena never regained consciousness. Doctors worked through the night as respiratory failure appeared in the worst cases. The toxin disrupted nerve signals controlling muscle movement, including breathing. 4 people died from the poisoning. The investigation later confirmed the algae wine contained a dangerous neurotoxin linked to harmful lagoon blooms. No laboratory safety testing had been done before the drink was served publicly, and earlier small batches likely gave organizers false confidence that it was safe. After the incident, health officials issued warnings across nearby communities and temporarily restricted similar festival food and drink events until new safety rules were introduced for testing, preparation, and public serving procedures. It was November 3, 2018, and a luxury resort along the Gulf Coast was hosting a high-profile food competition funded by a billionaire entrepreneur known for sponsoring extravagant culinary events. Contestants from across the country had gathered for the invitation-only event, which challenged participants to identify ingredients, evaluate flavors, and distinguish subtle differences between some of the world's most expensive specialty foods. Giancarlo Marinelli was 37 years old and worked as a restaurant consultant for several luxury hospitality ventures owned by his billionaire father-in-law. Passionate about food and always eager to experience something new, he regularly attended culinary festivals, tasting events, and industry gatherings. The competition offered one of the largest prizes he had ever pursued, and he arrived determined to make the most of the opportunity. For someone like Giancarlo, that sounds like a dream assignment. Unlike traditional cooking contests, contestants spent most of the day tasting and evaluating food rather than preparing it. Throughout multiple rounds, participants sampled small portions of specialty products while judges scored their accuracy and observations. As competitors were gradually eliminated, the remaining finalists were required to participate in increasingly demanding tasting sessions. By mid-afternoon, Giancarlo had advanced into the final group. The last round centered around bitter apricot kernels, a specialty ingredient sometimes used in luxury culinary and confectionery products. Contestants were asked to evaluate the ingredient repeatedly under different preparations and flavor combinations. Individual portions remained small, but the tastings continued for hours as judges narrowed the field. I can see how easy it would be to get caught up in something like that, especially with a prize on the line. As the competition entered its final stages, Giancarlo remained near the top of the standings. Determined to stay competitive, he participated in every tasting session and rarely stepped away from the judging area. Several contestants took extended breaks between rounds, but Giancarlo continued pushing forward. Late in the afternoon, he began experiencing mild abdominal discomfort. After hours of tasting food, a minor stomach ache didn't seem particularly unusual. Giancarlo brushed it aside and continued competing. As the evening progressed, however, the discomfort gradually worsened. He became increasingly nauseated and complained of cramping that seemed to intensify after each additional round. Witnesses later recalled that he appeared noticeably fatigued by the end of the competition, though he remained determined to finish. By the time the final scores were announced, Giancarlo looked visibly unwell. He complained of worsening abdominal pain and nausea, but declined suggestions to seek immediate medical attention. Instead, he returned to his accommodations hoping rest would help. Throughout the night, his condition continued deteriorating. The pain became increasingly severe, and repeated vomiting left him dehydrated and exhausted. Eventually, he contacted emergency services as the symptoms became impossible to manage on his own. Giancarlo was transported for treatment, but despite continued medical intervention, he died the following morning. The sad part is that Giancarlo was doing something he genuinely loved, and he never got the chance to enjoy the prize he was competing for. Attention soon centered on the bitter apricot kernels featured throughout the final round. Ingredient records, serving logs, medical findings, and leftover samples revealed no contamination or preparation errors. Instead, testing confirmed elevated exposure to naturally occurring cyanogenic compounds present in the kernels. While small tastings are generally considered safe, finalists in the competition spent hours repeatedly sampling the ingredient through multiple rounds and evaluation. Competition records showed that Giancarlo participated in nearly every tasting session and accumulated one of the highest levels of exposure among all contestants. Investigators concluded that repeated tastings over several hours resulted resulted in an unusually high intake that would be unlikely under normal dining conditions. The final report concluded that Giancarlo died from complications related to cyanide toxicity caused by excessive consumption of the ingredient. The death was ruled accidental, and a later review of the competition format identified how repeated tastings had allowed exposure to exceed intended limits. It was January 22, 2015, at a public high school in Seoul, South Korea. The cafeteria was loud and crowded, trays sliding across plastic tables, chairs scraping tile floors. Students talked over one another, phones raised casually, lunch staff moving between lines, routine noise filling the room during midday break. Sitting alone at one of the tables was Min-jae Park, 16 years old. His classmates described him as quiet and smart. He ranked near the top of his class and rarely drew attention. After school, he helped his mother manage accounts for her small restaurant, recording receipts and balancing handwritten notebooks. Teachers described him as reliable but socially unnoticed. He avoided conflict, moving carefully through crowded halls. That lunch period was no different. He sat where space opened briefly, surrounded by motion and noise that paid little attention to who occupied it. Long tables packed students close together. Lunch aides rotated through stations, each responsible for hundreds of teenagers at once. Surveillance cameras covered wide angles from the ceiling, recording movement without sound, as routine noise masked the first signs of distress. That day, a classmate brought oversized sticky rice cakes purchased outside the school grounds. They were dense, elastic, and made from pounded glutinous rice designed to be sliced before eating. During lunch, a group dared Min-jae to swallow one whole. Phones were raised immediately, framing his hesitation. He paused longer than usual, handling the rice cake briefly before lifting it, aware of the risk but unwilling to look weak. Rice cakes were a known choking hazard, especially when eaten quickly. Posters on cafeteria walls warned students to chew thoroughly. No teacher intervened. A nearby lunch aide glanced over, saw laughter, and turned away. The moment passed without correction. The pressure to perform outweighed caution, and the crowd sensed something worth recording. Min-jae placed the rice cake into his mouth. It resisted his teeth, stretching instead of breaking apart. Students leaned closer, voices rising. He forced it backward with a hard swallow. His throat moved visibly as the mass passed the tongue without fragmenting. The phones tightened their focus, waiting for either success or embarrassment. The mass slid past his tongue and lodged high in his throat. Saliva rapidly soaked into the surface. The rice expanded, forming a dense, rubbery plug that sealed his airway completely. Min-jae slammed both hands on the table. His eyes widened. Color drained from his face as airflow stopped. Laughter continued for seconds that mattered. Someone shouted encouragement. Min-jae stood, staggered, and collapsed sideways into the aisle. His chest heaved without sound. A lunch aide froze, unsure what she was seeing. Students backed away, still recording, as his legs stiffened and then went slack. Emergency services were called immediately. Attempts to dislodge the obstruction failed. The rice cake compressed briefly under force, but rebounded, maintaining its shape. Min-jae lost consciousness in under 40 seconds. Paramedics arrived minutes later. There was no clear airway left to open. The medical examiner found a single compact mass completely blocking the airway from the upper throat downward. Once wet, the rice cake conformed tightly to the airway walls, resisting removal. Oxygen never reached the lungs. The heart continued briefly, then failed as the brain shut down from lack of air. There were no underlying medical conditions. The footage circulated through the school before administrators intervened. Counseling was offered to witnesses, and recording devices were confiscated. Rice cake portions were restricted to bite-sized servings the following week. The policy change was formally documented as a direct response to Min-jae Park's death. It was June 30th, 2018, and a Saturday evening crowd filled a steakhouse in Amarillo. The standalone restaurant sat near the highway, its neon sign promoting a well-known eating challenge. Inside, the air conditioning battled the Texas heat as the dining room buzzed with conversation and clinking silverware. A chalkboard near the entrance listed past challenge winners and their completion times. Lesta Quiv, a 44-year-old woman who worked in logistics coordination for a trucking company, had driven to the restaurant with 3 friends after hearing about the establishment's 72-ounce steak challenge. Lesta had a determined personality and rarely backed down from a test of willpower, whether at work or in her personal life. Her friends knew her as someone who committed fully to whatever she attempted. The challenge rules were straightforward. Finish the massive steak along with accompanying sides within 1 hour, and the meal was free. Fail, and the bill came to over $50. Lesta had announced her intention to try it earlier that week, brushing off concerns from coworkers who thought the portion size was excessive. The server brought out the platter shortly after she signed the waiver. The steak covered most of the oversized plate, a thick slab of beef cooked to her requested medium rare. Steam rose from the surface, and the meat glistened with moisture. A digital timer on the table was set and started. Spectators at nearby tables turned to watch, some pulling out phones to record. Lesta picked up her knife and fork and began cutting into the steak, carving off pieces and eating them in quick succession. Her friends offered encouragement from across the table, tracking her progress against the countdown. As the minutes passed, Lesta's pace increased. She was roughly 20 minutes into the challenge when she cut off a particularly thick section from the center of the steak. The piece was dense and inadequately chewed, but she was focused on the clock. She placed the large chunk into her mouth and attempted to swallow it after only a few bites. The meat lodged firmly in her throat, sealing her airway completely and becoming stuck at the level of the larynx. Her eyes widened, and she dropped her utensils onto the plate with a loud clatter. Her hands immediately went to her neck, fingers pressing against her throat in the universal sign of choking. The noise level in the restaurant dropped as people nearby realized something was wrong. Lesta stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. Her face flushed red, then began turning darker as seconds passed without air. She could not speak or cough. One of her friends jumped up and moved behind her, wrapping arms around her torso to attempt the Heimlich maneuver. The first thrust produced no result. A second attempt, then a third, failed to dislodge the obstruction. A server rushed over to assist, and together they continued the abdominal thrusts, but the piece of steak remained wedged in place. Lesta's movements became weaker. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed forward onto the floor between tables. Her skin had taken on a bluish tint, and her body went limp. Someone in the restaurant had already called emergency services. Staff members cleared space around her and continued attempts to clear the airway, but without success. Her breathing had stopped entirely. By the time paramedics arrived, approximately 6 minutes had elapsed since the initial obstruction. Responders immediately began advanced airway management using specialized equipment to remove the blockage. They extracted the piece of steak and initiated resuscitation protocols, but the prolonged oxygen deprivation had already caused irreversible damage. Lesta was transported to a nearby hospital, where she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner's report confirmed that death resulted from asphyxiation due to complete airway obstruction by a large food bolus lodged at the larynx. The piece of steak recovered measured approximately 2 inches across. The restaurant suspended the eating challenge for the remainder of the evening while authorities documented the scene. The incident was officially classified as an accidental choking death during a timed eating competition. It was February 11, 2018 in Des Moines, Iowa, inside a roadside steakhouse near the interstate. Customers filled the dining room and bar area while a college basketball game played on televisions mounted above the counter. Trellis Goad, 51 years old, worked long hours as a diesel truck mechanic at a repair shop a few miles down the road. He had been employed there for nearly 14 years, specializing in engine overhauls and brake systems for heavy commercial vehicles. His shifts typically ran 10 to 12 hours, often ending well after dark. He often stopped at this steakhouse after his shifts ended, usually sitting at the bar counter rather than at a table. He was known among the staff as a regular who ate quickly and rarely lingered after finishing. That evening, he arrived around 7:15, still wearing his work jacket with grease stains on the sleeves. Trellis ordered a 16-ounce ribeye steak, cooked medium rare, with mashed potatoes and green beans. He also ordered a beer from the tap. The steak arrived roughly 12 minutes later on a white ceramic plate. Steam rose from the meat as it was set down in front of him. Trellis cut the steak into several thick pieces as he ate, the sections varying in size, some measuring close to 2 inches across. Trellis began eating while watching the game and talking with other patrons seated nearby. The bar was shoulder to shoulder busy. He ate with his fork, cutting through the slices and lifting them directly to his mouth. The noise level made conversation difficult. He drank from his beer between bites. He cut a dense cube of steak from one of the larger slices. The piece measured somewhere between 1.5 to 2 inches across, visibly thicker than the others on his plate. Without chewing it down further, he placed it in his mouth and attempted to swallow. The meat lodged in his airway immediately. Trellis stood abruptly from the bar stool, his sudden movement knocking a glass of water off the counter. It shattered on the tile floor near his feet. He gripped the edge of the bar with both hands, leaning forward, his face beginning to redden. His breathing stopped entirely. The patrons nearest to him noticed first. One man, seated 2 stools away, asked if he was choking. Trellis did not respond verbally, but gestured toward his throat with one hand. His eyes widened, and his mouth remained open. 2 customers moved in to attempt the Heimlich maneuver. One positioned himself behind Trellis and wrapped his arms around his torso, delivering upward thrusts below the ribcage. The steak did not move. Another patron tried the same technique, applying forceful compressions from behind while Trellis leaned against the bar for support. His skin color shifted from red to a darker shade as oxygen deprivation set in. Within 2 to 3 minutes, his legs buckled. He collapsed onto the restaurant floor beside the bar, landing on his side near the broken glass. One of the staff members immediately called emergency services, while others cleared space around him. Patrons continued attempting chest compressions and airway clearance while waiting for paramedics to arrive. Emergency responders reached the steakhouse within approximately 8 minutes of the call. They worked to clear the obstruction using medical tools and suction equipment designed for airway emergencies. The lodged piece of steak was eventually extracted after several attempts, but Trellis did not regain consciousness. Paramedics administered oxygen and performed advanced cardiac life support procedures on site before loading him onto a stretcher. He was transported to a nearby hospital where he was later pronounced dead. Investigators reviewed security footage from cameras positioned above the bar area. The footage showed the sequence of events clearly, including the moment Trellis stood and the attempts by other customers to assist him. Restaurant staff provided written statements describing what they had witnessed. The county medical examiner's office documented the death as accidental asphyxiation caused by an obstructed airway during a meal. The piece of steak that caused the blockage was noted in the official report as being significantly larger than what is typically considered safe to swallow whole. It was May 9, 2014, in Skuon, Cambodia. The evening market was packed, hot and loud, with smoke hanging low between stalls. One stand had a crowd around it for fried tarantulas, and honestly, that setup alone already feels like a bad idea. Live spiders in one tray, hot oil a few inches away, and tourists leaning in like it's harmless. Earlier that evening, Benjamin Carter, 31, had only been in Cambodia for a few hours. He worked seasonal jobs in Australia, mostly warehouse and landscaping work, and had saved for months to afford the trip. The reason he came was simple and kind of sad. He was meeting his long-distance girlfriend in person for the first time after more than a year of calls and messages. That detail matters because this wasn't someone chasing danger. This was someone trying to have a good moment. But by most accounts, Benjamin had one habit that shows up in a lot of cases like this. He followed along until something unusual came up, and then he pushed a little too far, especially when people were watching. The stall itself didn't leave much room for mistakes. A low counter, a tray of live tarantulas, and a shallow pan of hot oil sitting right behind the vendor's hands. No barriers, no space to step back. Benjamin and his girlfriend moved with the crowd, stopping where people gathered. The tarantula stand pulled them in right away. From a distance, it looked controlled. Up close, it wasn't. There wasn't much space between the customers and the cooking area, and people were leaning in to see everything. He asked to hold one. The vendor showed him how. Grip it from behind, keep it away from your face. Simple enough. Benjamin took it anyway but held it wrong, pinching it near the legs instead of controlling it. Not a big mistake on its own, but this is usually how things build. One small bad move, then another. People nearby noticed. Someone gestured for him to stop. The vendor stayed half-turned, watching both him and the hot oil. Benjamin lifted the spider higher, closer to his mouth, like he was turning the moment into something bigger. And this is where everything stacks up at once. The tarantula reacted as he brought it too close, biting near his mouth. He snapped back immediately, instinct taking over. He jerked his head away and dropped the spider, coughing hard as he tried to recover from the sudden pain. Witnesses said he bent forward, focused on the bite. Then, the next mistake. As he stepped back, still coughing, his arm hit the edge of the cooking setup. The pan shifted, hot oil splashed up into his lower face, lips, and mouth. And this is the part that really matters. He inhaled at the same time. That pulled in hot air and small droplets. I've gone through a lot of these cases, and even those viral food accident clips. And it's almost always this exact moment where everything becomes irreversible. Not the first mistake, but the second one that stacks on top of it. He dropped to his knees within seconds. People pulled him away from the stall while someone called for help. His breathing turned rough, then high-pitched, then weaker. It went from loud panic to barely any air at all. Emergency responders got there in a few minutes, but by then he was already in bad shape. The post-mortem was clear. The inside of his throat had been burned. Not just the surface, the airway itself. That tissue swelled quickly, and once it swells enough, air just can't move through. The tarantula bite wasn't deadly. The venom wasn't enough to cause serious harm. Even swallowing it didn't kill him. That's the part people usually get wrong. What killed him was the hot oil. Investigators treated it as an accidental death tied to unsafe handling at a street food stall. And honestly, that's the part that sticks with me. The spider made it chaotic, but the real danger was right there the whole time, sitting in a pan a few inches away. It was September 9th in 2015, along a roadside stretch in Guangxi, China, where early traffic had already started building. Trucks rolled in and out in steady intervals, engines idling as drivers stopped for quick meals. The air smelled like broth and spices, something you could notice before you even stepped out. Jun Wei was 36, a long-haul truck driver who had been on the road for nearly 3 weeks. He kept things simple, same routes, same stops, same meals. He wasn't the type to try something new, especially when he was tired. Familiar meant safe. And that morning, he pulled into a stall he had eaten at before and ordered braised beef noodles. The broth was what people came for. Slightly sweet, heavily spiced, and simmering since before sunrise. The roadside stall was popular with drivers stopping during long highway trips. Jun Wei finished his meal, paid, and walked back toward his truck. Later, investigators reviewing CCTV noticed him reaching for the driver's side door before suddenly pausing, like he needed a moment to steady himself. Then he tried moving again, but something was wrong with his balance. He turned back toward the stall slowly, one hand brushing against the truck for support. At first, it looked like exhaustion, but then more customers started reacting. A few mentioned dizziness. One blamed the heat, while another sat back down after saying his hands suddenly felt weak. Within minutes, people were vomiting beside the tables. Conversations became difficult as some customers struggled to respond clearly. One woman near the counter reportedly stared blankly at her husband for several seconds before collapsing onto the bench. Jun Wei was still conscious, but barely stable. Witnesses said his movements became jerky and uncoordinated, almost like his body was responding half a second too late to what he wanted it to do. Then the seizures started. One man collapsed beside a table and began convulsing violently on the concrete floor. Another customer grabbed the side of a parked motorcycle before losing control of his legs completely. A child stopped responding while his father carried him toward a nearby vehicle, screaming for help. That's when the stall owner realized this wasn't food poisoning in the normal sense and stopped serving immediately. But by then, dozens had already eaten. People were moved toward the roadside. Some lay flat on the ground, while relatives tried holding them upright. There was no organized emergency response at first, just panic and improvisation. Passing vehicles were flagged down. Victims were loaded into back seats, truck beds, and cargo compartments because the nearest hospital was over an hour away. The moment multiple people start losing control of their bodies at the same time, everything turns chaotic because nobody nobody around them understands what's actually happening yet. Junwei was among those transported to the hospital. During the ride, his condition worsened rapidly. The dizziness turned into a near-total loss of coordination. Then his muscles began tightening uncontrollably as repeated seizures hit one after another. At the hospital, doctors struggled to stabilize multiple patients arriving at nearly the same time. The symptoms didn't behave like ordinary bacterial food poisoning. Patients showed severe neurological distress, confusion, muscle spasms, seizures, and eventually respiratory failure as the nervous system lost control over breathing muscles. 9 people died. At first, investigators couldn't explain it. The food looked normal. The broth smelled normal. Nothing about the preparation immediately stood out. The answer came later during laboratory testing. Authorities traced the contamination back to the spice mixture used in the broth that morning. Investigators found that one bulk sack had been contaminated with seeds from a toxic plant related to poisonous moonflower species, which can resemble culinary spices once dried and crushed. And that's what made the mistake so dangerous. Once mixed into the broth, there was no unusual color or smell to warn anyone. And because the soup simmered for hours, the toxic compounds spread evenly instead of breaking down. Autopsies later confirmed the cause. The plant toxin attacked the nervous system, disrupting signals between the brain and muscles. That's why the symptoms appeared in stages: dizziness, confusion, loss of coordination, seizures, and eventually paralysis of the muscles needed to breathe. Junwei didn't take a risk that morning. He did what most people would do. He chose something familiar, something he trusted. But sometimes it's not about what you choose. It's about what's already there, unnoticed. It was May 12, 2016, and a renovated farmhouse outside Portland, Oregon was buzzing with activity as a woman prepared what she called the perfect meal. Built around ingredients she had spent months researching and sourcing, the dinner represented nearly a year of planning and refinement. Jocelyn Underwood was 38 years old and had become a billionaire after selling a highly successful media company. With few business obligations remaining, she spent much of her time traveling, exploring culinary traditions, and seeking out rare ingredients from around the world. Food had become less of a hobby and more of a personal passion, one she pursued with remarkable dedication. There's something admirable about that level of dedication, even if it can be a little difficult for the rest of us to understand. The dinner was meant to celebrate the completion of a personal project she had spent nearly a year developing. Every ingredient on the menu had been chosen for a reason. The vegetables came from small local farms, the herbs had been grown on the property, and even the cooking methods had been refined through repeated testing. One ingredient, however, received more attention than all the others combined. Several weeks earlier, Jocelyn had acquired a wheel of cave-aged artisan cheese from a small independent producer. The cheese was expensive, difficult to obtain, and considered by many enthusiasts to be among the finest examples of its kind. She stored it carefully and checked on it frequently, since it would be the centerpiece of the entire meal. Throughout the afternoon, Jocelyn moved between the kitchen and dining room, making final preparations. Then, by early evening, guests began arriving, and the meal unfolded exactly as she had hoped. Near the end of dinner, Jocelyn finally served the ingredient she had spent months anticipating. She sampled it herself before offering portions to several guests. A few minutes later, one guest remarked that the cheese tasted slightly different than expected, though nobody considered it serious at the time. Curious, Jocelyn tried it again. Something about it seemed slightly off, but not enough to cause concern. At the time, the unusual flavor seemed like a minor detail in an otherwise successful evening. The evening gradually wound down. Guests lingered around the dining table while Jocelyn began clearing dishes and organizing leftovers in the kitchen. Roughly an hour later, she suddenly felt lightheaded and stopped what she was doing. Thinking she might simply be exhausted after a long day, she leaned against a counter and waited for the sensation to pass. Instead, it intensified. Nausea followed, along with a sharp pain in her abdomen that forced her to sit down. Repeated bouts of vomiting left her increasingly weak, and she struggled to remain focused during conversations. Friends immediately called for help, while others stayed beside her. As the minutes passed, she became increasingly confused and had difficulty answering simple questions. Her Her breathing grew more labored, and the pain she described appeared to be worsening. By the time responders arrived, Jocelyn was barely conscious. She was transported for treatment, but her condition continued declining throughout the night. Despite intensive medical intervention, she died the following day. There's something especially sad about how much of herself she poured into that dinner, only for the evening to end the way it did. Attention eventually turned to the cave-aged cheese served near the end of the meal. Testing revealed contamination by Clostridium botulinum during the aging process, allowing botulinum toxin to develop despite the cheese appearing normal. Investigators also found that Jocelyn had sampled the cheese repeatedly throughout the day, consuming far more than any of her guests. Combined with uneven toxin distribution within the wheel, that likely explains why her symptoms became far more severe than those experienced by others. The final report concluded that Jocelyn died from acute botulinum toxin poisoning after consuming the contaminated cheese. The death was ruled accidental, and production records later helped identify failures during the aging process. It was March 19th, 2014, inside a public senior community center in northern Ohio. The dining hall carried the smell of steamed vegetables and disinfectant. Trays moved along plastic rails, chairs scraped softly, and conversations overlapped at low volume. Fluorescent lights hummed above long tables arranged for routine, unhurried meals. Eleanor Finch was visiting the center that day. She was 78 years old, a retired public librarian who had spent 4 decades organizing information for other people. Her friends said she's organized, follow routines, and quiet courtesy. Even in retirement, she kept schedules written in pencil and volunteered twice a week at the senior center's reading room, shelving donated books and helping residents navigate large print catalogs without drawing attention to herself. She disliked causing interruptions and avoided medical complaints, treating them as inconveniences rather than concerns. Her dentures had never fit quite right. They shifted subtly during firmer bites, but Eleanor refused adjustments. She said she ate slowly, cut carefully, and had managed well enough for years. Staff knew this and often checked her plate, but she waved off concern with practiced ease. She took pride in not needing help. Dinner service that evening followed the usual schedule. Baked white fish was served with steamed vegetables and a soft dinner roll. The fish was labeled deboned. Eleanor sat at a regular table with 3 women she'd known for years. She spoke mid-bite, laughing quietly, posture relaxed. The room carried the steady noise of trays, chairs, and low conversation. There were no warnings posted, no special precautions announced. Fish night was considered safe and familiar. Staff moved between tables, refilling water and clearing plates. One aide noticed Eleanor talking while eating, but didn't interrupt. Nothing in the room suggested risk or urgency. The center's fixed security cameras had already recorded the dining hall earlier that evening as part of routine coverage. As Eleanor swallowed, a thin pin bone left behind during processing slid backward instead of down. It rotated upright and lodged at the opening of her airway. She stopped speaking mid-word. Her face tightened. She lifted one hand slightly as if asking for a pause. One of her friends leaned over and patted her back, assuming a simple cough. Eleanor tried to inhale. No air moved. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her chest rose without airflow. She pushed her chair back and stood, unsteady. The bone shifted deeper, sealing the airway completely. She took 2 steps before collapsing between tables, striking a chair leg on the way down. Staff reacted immediately as she fell. Emergency services were called without delay. Basic assistance was attempted, but nothing cleared the blockage. Her body lost tension quickly. Her lips darkened as oxygen dropped. A separate camera covering the serving line captured her collapse from a second angle, confirming the sequence already seen earlier. Paramedics arrived minutes later. By then, Eleanor had no pulse. Resuscitation efforts continued briefly, but showed no response. The obstruction was removed during post-mortem handling, not during treatment. The dining hall was cleared quietly. Dinner service ended early, trays left unfinished where they sat. The coroner's report described a single sharp fish bone lodged vertically at the top of the airway, acting like a plug. Air could not pass around it. Oxygen loss caused loss of consciousness in under a minute. There was no heart attack or stroke. She died from suffocation. The report noted that poorly fitting dentures likely reduced her ability to feel the bone and respond quickly. The death was ruled accidental. No negligence was assigned, though the recordings confirmed brief hesitation commonly observed in choking emergencies. In the weeks that followed, the center removed all bone-in fish from its menu. Staff completed additional choking response training. Eleanor's volunteer shift was reassigned without ceremony. A small plaque was mounted near the dining hall entrance, listing her name and years of service. Her donated books were boxed and stored for months before being returned to circulation, a quiet reminder that familiar routines can still fail when small dangers are dismissed as harmless. It was May 14, 2016, on the Charleston waterfront, where groups gathered along the docks for an evening oyster roast. Folding tables lined the pier, covered in newspaper, ice buckets, and piles of freshly steamed oysters. String lights hung overhead, and boats rocked quietly nearby at low tide, exposing barnacled pilings beneath the planks. The warm, humid air carried the smell of seawater and grills as people talked, ate, and drank along the harbor. Paxton Bleak, a 29-year-old bartender known for his easygoing nature and quick wit, had just finished a closing shift at a downtown establishment. He arrived at the oyster roast with several co-workers, still wearing his work shoes and carrying the restless energy of someone who spent hours on their feet serving others. Paxton had a reputation among friends for being the life of any gathering, always willing to take on a dare or show off some ridiculous skill. His co-workers often joked that he never turned down a challenge, no matter how absurd. Tonight was no different. As the group settled in around one of the tables, someone mentioned his signature party trick, swallowing oysters whole without chewing, straight from the shell. The crowd around him grew as he reached for another oyster from the pile. One of his co-workers pulled out a phone to record, angling it to catch the moment. Paxton grinned, tilting his head back in exaggerated showmanship. The oyster he grabbed had been poorly shucked, a detail no one noticed in the dim light and casual atmosphere. A jagged fragment of shell remained attached to the slick gray meat hidden beneath the brine. He brought it to his lips, tipped his head further back, and swallowed it in one motion. The sharp shell fragment scraped into the soft tissue at the back of his throat as it went down. Instead of passing cleanly, the jagged piece caught high in his pharynx and shifted sideways. The obstruction triggered violent coughing almost instantly. Blood mixed with mucus as the fragment partially blocked his airway, and each cough only seemed to wedge it more firmly in place. Paxton's expression changed from playful to alarmed. He coughed again, harder, spraying flecks of blood onto the newspaper-covered table. His hands flew to his neck as he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The laughter around him died instantly. He tried to speak, but only produced a harsh, choking rasp. More blood-tinged saliva spilled from his mouth as his body struggled to clear the obstruction. Air whistled unevenly through his throat, followed by wet, desperate gasps. Someone shouted for help while another person grabbed his shoulders to steady him, but Paxton's legs buckled. He dropped to his knees on the dock, then collapsed forward onto the weathered planks. His breathing became frantic and shallow, each attempt producing a gurgling sound as fluid and the lodged fragment restricted airflow. Within a couple of minutes, his movements slowed, then stopped entirely as oxygen deprivation took hold. One of the co-workers immediately called emergency services while others tried to help, tilting his head and attempting to clear his airway. The dispatcher instructed them to continue trying to keep the airway open until paramedics arrived, but the obstruction remained firmly lodged and Paxton's breathing did not resume. By the time the ambulance reached the waterfront and responders loaded him onto a stretcher, nearly 8 minutes had passed since the initial injury. Paxton was transported to a nearby hospital, but efforts to restore breathing and circulation were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. During the examination, the medical staff recovered the oyster shell fragment still lodged deep in his upper throat. The injury had caused bleeding and airway obstruction, with aspiration and oxygen deprivation leading to cardiac arrest. The official cause of death was listed as airway obstruction and hemorrhage, resulting from sharp foreign object ingestion. Investigators reviewed the phone footage and witness statements, confirming the sequence of events. The incident was classified as an accidental death occurring at a private social gathering. The oyster roast was shut down for the remainder of the evening as authorities documented the scene. It was October 14, 2016, in Dayton, Ohio, where the morning shift had begun inside a public middle school cafeteria responsible for feeding about 420 students each day. Along the prep area, several identical 5-gallon white buckets were placed near the counters, used throughout the morning for tasks like vegetable rinsing, floor cleaning, and sanitizing surfaces. Maddie Kesh was 34 years old and had spent 7 years working in the same cafeteria. She was known among staff as reliable and efficient, someone who followed the daily routine without much variation. She also had a habit of rushing routine tasks, relying on memory instead of double-checking details others would normally verify. That morning, she was dealing with a sinus infection that had dulled her sense of smell almost completely. Earlier in the shift, a co-worker heard her say she could barely detect the scent of onions while chopping them for the lunch menu. It seemed like a minor inconvenience. She had also skipped breakfast, planning to taste test the stew once it was nearly finished. Around mid-morning, a janitor filled one of the white buckets with a chlorine-based disinfectant mixture and placed it on the floor beside the prep counter while cleaning nearby floor drains. Several identical 5-gallon buckets were already in the same area for different kitchen tasks, and none had labels or clear markings to distinguish their contents. Maddie was finishing a 12-gallon pot of chicken vegetable stew, stirring it with a long metal paddle as it simmered on the stovetop. Steam rose from the broth into the ventilation hood above. While stirring, Maddie reached for the bucket closest to her, assuming it contained vegetable rinse water she had used earlier. She did not look inside the bucket or confirm what it contained, even though the liquid was unfamiliar to the recipe. Without checking, she lifted it and poured roughly half a gallon of liquid into the simmering stock pot. The decision took only seconds, a shortcut she often used while rushing through kitchen work. The liquid mixed quickly into the broth as she stirred. Because her sense of smell was severely impaired, she did not detect the sharp chemical odor that normally would have been obvious. She set the bucket down and continued stirring. A few minutes later, with the lunch bell approaching, Maddie ladled a small bowl of the stew to check the seasoning before it was served to students. Despite adding an unknown liquid moments earlier, she still made no attempt to verify what it was. She swallowed several spoonfuls. Within seconds, she began coughing violently. The bowl slipped from her hand and shattered on the tile floor. She grabbed the edge of the prep table as intense burning pain spread through her throat and chest. Her body reacted immediately, triggering gagging and vomiting as the caustic liquid irritated her airway and stomach. She stumbled away from the stove, gasping as the burning sensation spread into her abdomen. 2 staff members immediately called for help. The school nurse arrived within a minute and found Maddie conscious but in severe distress, struggling to speak through coughing and vomiting. Paramedics arrived about 8 minutes later and transported her to a nearby hospital, where doctors identified signs of corrosive chemical ingestion. Maddie described what she had tasted, and hospital staff contacted the school to determine the substance involved. Investigators later found the bucket still beside the prep counter. Testing confirmed it contained chlorine-based disinfectant intended only for sanitizing surfaces. Health inspectors documented that identical buckets for chemicals and food preparation had been stored in the same area with no labeling system. Investigators also noted Maddie had poured an unidentified liquid directly into food without confirming its contents, a basic safety step in commercial kitchens. The stew was immediately discarded, and no students were served from the contaminated batch. Maddie remained hospitalized as doctors treated severe chemical burns to her throat, esophagus, and stomach. Over the following days, the internal damage worsened, leading to infection and organ failure. Several days after the incident, she died from those complications. The official cause of death was listed as fatal complications from corrosive ingestion of a chlorine-based cleaning solution. The school district later implemented color-coded containers and mandatory labeling for all cleaning chemicals used in food service areas. Investigators concluded the fatal mistake occurred when an unknown liquid was added to food without verification, setting the chain of events in motion. What followed showed how quickly overlooked judgment can escalate into irreversible consequences. It was October 21st, 2018, in Austin, Texas, at a crowded street fair packed with dessert stands, food, trucks, and people shoulder to shoulder. From the outside, it looked harmless. And honestly, that's what makes this case frustrating. Nothing about it looked risky, but everything about it actually was. Earlier that afternoon, Ethan Rowe, 22, was walking through the fair with 2 friends from school. He was a second-year pre-med student, the type who knew the right answers, understood emergencies, and could explain things clearly. Which makes this even harder to watch play out, because he wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what a peanut allergy could do. And that's the problem. People around him said Ethan had gotten comfortable. Years had passed without a serious reaction, and that changed how seriously he treated it. He still carried an EpiPen, but not where it mattered. It stayed in his bag instead of somewhere he could grab fast, and the fare didn't help. Fast lines, messy setups, handwritten menus, and allergen labels half hidden behind trays. It was the perfect place for a bad decision to slip through. The plan was simple: eat, walk, try whatever looked good, move on. At one dessert stall, Ethan picked up a Butterfinger-style cookie. He asked if it had peanuts. One friend, just guessing, said no, based on the name. And this is the part that always gets me. He stopped there. Didn't ask the vendor, didn't check the label, just went with it. He took a big bite. Within a minute or two, he started swallowing more than usual and clearing his throat. Nothing dramatic at first. And that's how these situations trick people. There's always that short moment where it still feels manageable. Ethan stayed near the stall and drank water instead of using the EpiPen. His friends noticed his face turning red, but he was still standing, still acting like it wasn't a real problem yet. Then, it changed. Swelling started around his lips, his voice got rough, his breathing turned loud enough for people nearby to notice over the crowd. Witnesses described a tight, high-pitched sound when he tried to breathe in. That sound usually means the airway is narrowing. Someone asked if he was okay, but by then, he couldn't answer properly. One person pulled him away from the counter, while another dug through his bag looking for the injector. And this is where everything goes wrong. Ethan tried to stay on his feet, but his balance started to go. This wasn't just breathing anymore. His blood pressure was dropping. He bent forward, stumbled, and went down on his side near the stall. A bystander called 911. Austin Travis County EMS got there in about 6 to 8 minutes, but by then, he was barely responding. Paramedics treated him for a severe allergic reaction and worked to open his airway, but the delay mattered. He was taken from the scene alive, but he didn't recover. The forensic findings were clear. Peanut exposure triggered a full anaphylactic reaction. His throat swelled, his airway narrowed, and at the same time, his blood pressure dropped to the point his body couldn't keep up. In simple terms, his body reacted so hard that he couldn't breathe properly, and his circulation failed at the same time. I've gone through a lot of disturbing case breakdowns, but this one stands out because nothing about it was hidden. It was all right there. The investigation found no issue with the food itself. The cookie contained peanuts, and the label was there, just not easy to see. Afterward, the fare required clearer allergen signs and better visibility at stalls. The cause of death was confirmed as anaphylactic shock. Witnesses also confirmed the EpiPen was there, just not used in time. And yeah, that's the part that sticks. It was May 4th, 2013, on the outskirts of Jakarta, and the reception area was already crowded before noon. Long tables were set under open tents, fans pushing warm air around, and a steady flow of guests moved between the food stations. From a distance, it looked like a normal wedding, busy, loud, and full. Nadia Putri was 24, a seamstress who had spent weeks helping prepare for this wedding. She wasn't part of the main program, but she had altered the bride's dress by hand after work, refusing payment because they were family. This was supposed to be the day she could finally stop working and just enjoy the celebration. The catering setup sat behind the reception area under a temporary canopy. It was built for speed, not organization. Folding tables were packed tightly together, and ingredients, utensils, sauces, and cleaning supplies were all kept within reach, so workers could move food quickly as guests filled the tables. By lunchtime, the place was busy. Food came out in batches: chicken, noodles, rice trays, and sauces brushed over each serving before they were carried toward the reception area. Guests ate, talked, and moved between tables like any normal wedding. Nothing felt unusual at first, but then small reactions started appearing. A few guests paused mid-bite. Some touched their throats like something didn't feel right. Others mentioned the food tasted stronger than expected, maybe too sharp, bitter. At first, nobody treated it seriously because the reactions seemed scattered and minor. Then, the burning sensation started. People began coughing almost at the same time across different tables. Some reached immediately immediately for water or soft drinks, trying to wash the taste away. Nadia was seen on phone footage lifting a plastic cup, taking a sip, then stopping almost instantly. According to relatives nearby, swallowing made the pain worse. Within minutes, the atmosphere changed completely. Guests started vomiting beside the tables. Others complained their throats felt tight or like they couldn't breathe properly. Conversations broke apart as more people stood up at once, trying to figure out what was happening. This is the disturbing part in cases like this. At first, nobody thinks chemical poisoning. People assume the food is spoiled or overly spicy. So, valuable time gets lost while everyone tries to understand why multiple healthy people are suddenly collapsing at the same event. Staff stopped serving food immediately, but by then, dozens had already eaten from the affected dishes. The situation escalated fast. Some guests became too weak to stand, while others struggled to speak as swelling spread through their throats. Relatives dragged chairs aside to make room as people coughed and vomited around the tables. Several victims were laid outside near parked vehicles because the reception area had become too chaotic. Ambulances were called, but there weren't enough. Families loaded victims into cars, motorcycles, and vans to reach nearby hospitals. Some could still walk with support. Others had to be carried after collapsing. At first, doctors weren't completely sure what they were dealing with. The symptoms pointed toward chemical exposure, but confirmation took time. Medical teams focused on stabilizing breathing, reducing swelling, and flushing toxins from the body wherever possible. Some patients improved. Others got worse very quickly. Within the next 24 hours, several conditions deteriorated as the internal damage continued spreading. Breathing became harder as swelling closed portions of the airway. Severe burns inside the throat and stomach made it difficult for some victims to even swallow water safely. In the most serious cases, the chemical exposure triggered shock and organ failure as the body lost control of fluid balance. Nadia, along with 4 other guests, didn't survive. The investigation later revealed exactly how it happened. During preparation, one of the kitchen helpers grabbed a clear plastic container believed to contain vinegar-based sauce mix commonly used for the chicken glaze. But earlier that morning, another worker had transferred industrial cleaning solution into a similar unlabeled container after the original bottle leaked during setup. The 2 containers were left side by side in the crowded prep area, and in the rush of service, nobody noticed the mistake. That's the terrifying part. This started from one small mistake in a busy kitchen. The liquid was mixed into one batch of sauce and brushed over multiple servings before reaching guests. Once diluted with spices, the contamination wasn't obvious. The food looked and smelled normal, so nobody questioned it until people started getting sick. Lab tests later confirmed the cleaning solution caused severe chemical burns to the mouth, throat, and digestive system. Tissue quickly began swelling and breaking down, making breathing difficult and, in some cases, blocking the airway completely. And all of it traced back to one mistake in a crowded temporary kitchen where 2 nearly identical containers sat side by side. It was February 8, 2018, and preparations were underway at a waterfront estate along the coast of Maine, ahead of a lavish private banquet hosted by a billionaire. While guests had yet to arrive, activity inside the temporary kitchen complex was already in full swing. Yvette Lee Winthrop was 44 years old and served as the longtime private chef for a billionaire family known for hosting lavish banquets and charitable events. Over the course of her career, she had overseen hundreds of large dinners, celebrations, and private gatherings. She was accustomed to long hours and demanding schedules, especially when preparing meals for clients with exacting expectations. It's the kind of job where everything is expected to be perfect. Even sometimes nobody notices the effort behind it. One of the banquet's main ingredients was king crab, a luxury seafood item that required extensive preparation before it could be served. Rather than arriving ready to use, it needed to be cleaned, processed, and portioned by hand. The work was tedious but familiar, and Yvette had performed similar preparation countless times throughout her career. Throughout the morning, she worked alongside a small kitchen team preparing ingredients for the evening service. As trays moved between workstations and prep tables filled with partially completed dishes, Yvette spent several hours handling the ingredient directly. The preparation process released fine airborne shellfish proteins that gradually accumulated throughout parts of the workspace as the day progressed. I have to admit, this is the kind of kitchen work most guests never think about. By the time food reaches the table, the hardest part is usually long over. Around mid-afternoon, Yvette began experiencing mild irritation in her eyes and throat. At first, she dismissed it as a normal consequence of working long hours in a busy kitchen. Large events often involved heat, fatigue, and little opportunity for rest, so the symptoms didn't seem particularly unusual. As the afternoon continued, however, the irritation became more noticeable. Her eyes watered frequently, and she developed a persistent cough that seemed to worsen whenever she returned to her workstation. Even then, nothing about the symptoms appeared serious enough to interrupt preparations. Over the next several hours, the discomfort continued building. By early evening, Yvette complained of chest tightness and increasing difficulty taking deep breaths. She stepped outside several times, hoping the fresh air would help, and while the symptoms briefly improved, they repeatedly returned once she resumed work. Despite the growing discomfort, she remained focused on keeping the banquet on schedule. As final preparations accelerated ahead of guest arrivals, Yvette's condition worsened significantly. The coughing became more frequent, her breathing increasingly strained, and routine tasks left her visibly exhausted. Shortly before guests were scheduled to arrive, she suddenly became severely distressed while working near one of the preparation stations. She struggled to catch her breath and was forced to stop working entirely. She'd spent hours trying to push through it, but there was only so much she could do. Kitchen staff immediately called for emergency assistance and moved her away from the preparation area. Despite those efforts, her breathing continued deteriorating. Within minutes, she became increasingly unable to communicate and eventually lost consciousness. Emergency responders arrived and transported Yvette for treatment, but her condition remained critical. Despite continued medical intervention, she died later that night before the banquet ever began. The event was canceled, and investigators later focused their attention on the king crab Yvette had spent much of the day preparing. Air samples, preparation records, residue collected from work surfaces, and medical findings were all reviewed as part of the investigation. Their findings revealed that microscopic shellfish proteins released during hours of cleaning, cutting, and processing the crab had accumulated throughout portions of the kitchen. Prolonged exposure triggered a severe respiratory reaction that progressively worsened throughout the day. The final report concluded that Yvette died from complications related to acute respiratory failure caused by occupational exposure to airborne shellfish proteins during food preparation. Investigators determined that the incident was accidental and found no evidence that any prepared dishes had become unsafe for guests. It was March 3, 2017, in a small residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Cebu City. The evening air was warm and still, the kind that lingered inside kitchens even after windows were opened. Inside a modest rented house, a compact private kitchen was lit by a single overhead bulb, its counters crowded with cutting boards, saucepans, and drying racks. 23-year-old Daniel Cruz had graduated from culinary school just 3 months earlier. He was newly licensed, recently hired as a junior prep cook, and eager to distinguish himself in a competitive field. Friends described him as meticulous and stubborn, especially when challenged. He followed recipes precisely, kept handwritten notebooks of experiments, and believed discipline could overcome most risks. Daniel had a known heart condition diagnosed during his final year in school. Doctors had cleared him for normal activity, but warned against extreme physical or physiological stress. He complied publicly, kept medication on schedule, and avoided heavy exertion. Privately, he believed he understood his body well enough to judge its limits. That evening, Daniel was working alone. He had been experimenting with ghost peppers, known for their extreme heat and high capsaicin content. His goal was to create a concentrated extract he could use sparingly in sauces. The process involved reducing pepper pulp over low heat, filtering solids, and further concentrating the liquid until only a small amount remained. The extract he produced was far stronger than commercial hot sauces. It was not intended for direct consumption. Daniel understood this, but curiosity and confidence overruled caution. He believed a controlled taste would tell him whether the extract was usable or excessive. No one else was present. No dilution was prepared. He dipped the tip of a spoon into the extract and tasted it. The reaction was immediate. Intense burning spread across his tongue and throat, far stronger than anything he had experienced before. He began sweating heavily within seconds. His breathing quickened as his body reacted to the sudden pain stimulus. He moved to the sink, rinsing his mouth with water, but the burning intensified instead of subsiding. Within minutes, Daniel felt nauseated. His heart rate increased sharply, pounding against his chest. Capsaicin does not poison the body, but it triggers a severe stress response, activating pain receptors and forcing the nervous system into overdrive. For someone with an underlying heart condition, the strain can be dangerous. Daniel attempted to sit down and regulate his breathing. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself against the counter. Chest tightness followed, then dizziness. His heart rhythm became irregular as his blood pressure spiked. The pain from the extract continued, layered with panic as his body failed to stabilize. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Emergency services were contacted later that evening after Daniel failed to respond to messages and a co-worker checked on him. Paramedics found him unresponsive. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The medical examiner found no evidence of poisoning, contamination, or substance use. Toxicology tests were negative for drugs and alcohol. The examination confirmed a pre-existing cardiac condition and signs consistent with acute cardiovascular stress. The cause of death was determined to be cardiac arrest triggered by extreme physiological stress following ingestion of a highly concentrated capsaicin extract. The heart had entered a fatal arrhythmia. Under strain it could not recover from. Investigators documented the homemade extract still on the kitchen counter. Its concentration was far beyond typical culinary use. The death was ruled accidental. Daniel's case was later referenced informally in culinary safety discussions, particularly among instructors who warned students about self-testing extreme ingredients and ignoring medical limitations. No regulations changed as a result. The kitchen was cleaned, the equipment removed, and the house rented again. The experiment ended where it began, alone, undocumented, and irreversible. It was December 12, 2016, in Honolulu, where a small private dinner gathering was taking place in a modest, single-story home near the coast. The sky had already darkened, and streetlights lit the quiet residential streets outside. The dining room windows were open to let in the trade winds, ceiling fans turning slowly overhead. The table was set with mismatched plates and serving dishes, reflecting an informal meal among acquaintances. Gunder Plett, a 50-year-old tourist from the mainland, had been invited to the dinner by someone he'd met during his 2-week vacation on the island. Gunder worked in logistics and had a reputation among friends for seeking out unusual experiences wherever he traveled. He collected stories about exotic foods and off-the-beaten-path encounters. His curiosity often led him to situations that more cautious travelers avoided. Tonight's dinner promised something he'd never tried before: pufferfish, prepared by the host who claimed to have learned the technique from a family member years earlier. The meal began with lighter dishes, and conversation flowed easily among the 6 people seated around the table. When the pufferfish was brought out on a plain white platter, sliced thin and arranged in overlapping rows, Gunder leaned forward with visible interest. The host explained the preparation process in general terms, but offered no credentials or formal training. No one at the table questioned the safety of the dish. Gunder took several pieces onto his plate and ate them quickly, commenting on the mild flavor. Others at the table also sampled the fish. Gunder was mid-conversation when he paused and touched his fingertips to his lips. He rubbed them together, then pressed his tongue against the roof of his mouth as if testing a sensation. Within moments, he mentioned that his lips felt numb. The numbness was spreading across his tongue and into his cheeks. His speech began to slur slightly, words coming out less clearly than before. The mood at the table shifted as people stopped eating and turned their attention toward him. The tingling sensation moved down his jaw and into his throat. Gunder stood up from his chair, steadying himself with one hand on the table edge. His face had gone pale, and his breathing sounded strained. He tried to explain what he was feeling, but his words were barely intelligible. His legs wavered beneath him, and he took an unsteady step backward before collapsing onto the floor. The other guests rushed to his side. Someone immediately called emergency services, while another person tried to keep him conscious. Gunder's chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular movements. His muscles had begun to fail in sequence, starting with his extremities and progressing inward toward his core. The paralysis reached his diaphragm and intercostal muscles, making it nearly impossible for him to draw breath. His eyes remained open, but he could no longer move or speak. His skin took on a grayish tint. His oxygen levels dropped. His breathing slowed to nothing as the lack of oxygen deepened. Cardiac arrest followed shortly after. Paramedics arrived approximately 12 minutes after the initial call. They began resuscitation efforts immediately, continuing them during transport to a nearby hospital. Despite aggressive intervention, Gunder could not be revived. Medical staff recognized the symptoms as consistent with tetrodotoxin poisoning, a neurotoxin found in improperly prepared pufferfish. Blood samples confirmed the presence of the toxin in lethal concentrations. Authorities confiscated the remaining fish and sent it to a laboratory, where testing verified that toxic portions had not been adequately removed. The official cause of death was listed as acute respiratory failure due to tetrodotoxin exposure from ingested pufferfish. Investigators determined that the individual who prepared the meal had no formal training or certification. The incident was classified as an accidental poisoning resulting from consumption of improperly handled seafood at a private residence. It was May 21, 2017, during a small evening family gathering at a single-story home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Several relatives were moving between the kitchen and living room as dinner was finishing. Plates had been arranged along the dining table beside bowls of fruit and desserts prepared earlier that afternoon. 20-year-old Jamie Blossoms had spent most of the day cooking. She wanted the dinner to go smoothly because her mother's boyfriend had been invited over for the evening, and she hoped preparing everything herself would leave a good impression. Jamie was enthusiastic but inexperienced in the kitchen. She rarely cooked full meals and usually relied on packaged foods between classes and part-time work shifts. Earlier that afternoon, she decided to try making a homemade rice pudding dessert from an online recipe. The instructions suggested finishing the dish with a small pinch of ground nutmeg to enhance the flavor. Jamie opened the spice cabinet and found a large plastic container of ground nutmeg sitting beside cinnamon and cloves. When she read the measurement in the recipe, the amount seemed surprisingly small. The instructions called for only a fraction of a teaspoon. Jamie hesitated, assuming such a small quantity would barely affect the taste. Instead of measuring the spice, she began adding it directly from the container while the pudding simmered on the stovetop. Several heaping tablespoons fell into the pot before she stopped. The dark spice blended into the creamy mixture as it thickened. Jamie tasted a spoonful and immediately noticed the flavor was unusually strong. Even so, she assumed the sweetness would balance the spice once the pudding cooled. She poured the mixture into a serving bowl and placed it in the refrigerator while the rest of the meal was prepared. By early evening, several family members had gathered around the table finishing dinner. Jamie carried the chilled dessert bowl into the dining room and began scooping generous portions into small dishes. The smell of nutmeg was noticeably stronger than expected as steam rose from the pudding. A few relatives commented on the intense flavor after the first bites. One relative noted that the spice tasted unusually strong, but Jamie reassured them it was safe. She explained that nutmeg was a common baking ingredient and believed adding more simply made the flavor richer. Jamie herself ate the largest serving, finishing nearly an entire bowl, while others took only a few bites before pushing their dishes aside. The evening continued normally as the gathering gradually wound down. Several hours later, after most guests had left, Jamie began feeling unwell. While sitting on the couch, she complained of nausea and dizziness. At first, the symptoms seemed mild, similar to an upset stomach after a heavy meal. Within another hour, her condition worsened. Her heart rate increased, and she became disoriented, describing strange sensations and difficulty focusing her vision. Family members noticed her speech becoming confused as she struggled to remain upright. The symptoms soon escalated into vomiting, agitation, and hallucinations. Emergency services were contacted as her condition rapidly deteriorated. Paramedics transported Jamie to a nearby hospital where doctors began treatment for suspected toxic ingestion. Medical staff later determined that Jamie had consumed an unusually large quantity of nutmeg. Toxicology tests identified elevated levels of myristicin, a compound known to cause severe neurological and cardiovascular effects when ingested in large amounts. Despite treatment, complications from the toxicity continued to worsen, and Jamie Blossoms later died at the hospital. Investigators later confirmed that the rice pudding contained several tablespoons of ground nutmeg, far exceeding typical culinary use. Family members who had tasted small portions reported no significant symptoms, and investigators determined that Jamie had consumed the largest amount of the dessert. The death was ultimately ruled a fatal poisoning caused by the excessive quantity of nutmeg added during preparation. It was July 18, 2017 in Jaipur, India. The evening market was packed, noisy, and routine, with flame-based food stalls working through lines of locals and tourists. Nothing looked out of control. That's what makes this disturbing case hit harder. Everything looked normal right up to the second it wasn't. Earlier that night, Adrian Velasquez, 29, was walking through the market with two travelers he had just met at a hostel. He worked as a warehouse loader in Valparaiso and had spent nearly 3 years saving for this trip, picking up extra shifts and cutting back on everything. He also helped support his younger sister. This was his first real break. And yeah, that part makes this whole thing hit harder. By most accounts, Adrian was quiet and practical, not someone people saw as reckless. But he had one flaw that mattered here. He didn't like being the only one who hesitated. And I've seen this in a lot of cases like this. It doesn't start as stupidity. It starts with not wanting to look unsure in front of other people. The Agni Pan stall itself was simple. The vendor put a leaf filled with sweet spices into a quick flame, then placed it into the customer's mouth. That was it. It only worked if you stayed still, closed your mouth right away, and didn't breathe in. That's the whole safety system. Miss one step, and it stops being a snack. Adrian stood there watching others go first. One after another, people stepped up, took the flame, and walked away laughing. No one hesitated, and no one got hurt. After a while, it stopped looking dangerous. And that's usually how these situations start, when something risky starts to feel normal. Before stepping forward, Adrian took a drink from a flask he had with him. Later on, people said he didn't swallow it right away. He kept it in his mouth. The vendor didn't notice, and honestly, there was no reason to expect it. From the outside, everything still looked normal. The instructions were repeated. Stay still, close your mouth, don't breathe in. Adrian nodded and stepped closer. As the burning leaf came toward him, he leaned forward slightly, and then he sneezed. The sneeze pushed a fine mist of alcohol out in front of his face. The flame hit that mist instantly, creating a quick flash that snapped back toward his lips. Witnesses described it as fast, not some big explosion, but sharp and direct, right at the opening of his mouth and nose. He jerked back, then inhaled hard. That one reflex changed everything. Instead of just burning the outside, he pulled hot gases into his throat. People nearby saw him grab his neck and drop to his knees. He tried to cough, but the sounds were weak and cut off. That's usually a bad sign, and yeah, this is the part where you realize it's not something you can walk off. One of the travelers noticed first that something was wrong. Someone called for help. Others pulled him away from the stall into open space. For a few seconds, it looked like he might recover. That's the false relief moment you see in a lot of cases like this. But then, his breathing changed. Witnesses said it turned high-pitched when he tried to inhale. That sound usually means the airway is narrowing. I've gone through enough forensic breakdowns to know that once that starts, you don't have much time. His breathing got slower, more strained, and then he stopped responding. Emergency services arrived a few minutes later, but by then he was already unresponsive. The post-mortem showed heat damage inside his airway, especially in the throat. Soot was found inside, which confirms he inhaled hot combustion gases. The outside burns were minor, and that's the part that always throws people off. From the outside, it didn't look that bad, but inside, his airway swelled until air couldn't pass through properly. In simple terms, he didn't die from the flame people saw. He died from what he inhaled. The investigation ruled it an accidental death caused by the altered handling of a flame-based street food. His friends confirmed he had taken a drink beforehand, but didn't realize he had kept it in his mouth. The vendor later added clearer warnings and checked more carefully before serving. It was July 22, 2017, in a small neighborhood in Cotabato, and the afternoon heat hadn't eased even as people started arriving for a backyard birthday. You could hear tricycles passing. Outside, music playing low from a speaker, and the smell of freshly cooked food drifting through the air. Ramon Della Serna was 32, a tricycle driver known around his neighborhood as the kind of person who always showed up for everyone else's events, birthdays, funerals, basketball leagues. He was usually there helping carry tables or driving people home afterward, but this time, it was his celebration. He had spent months saving money for a proper birthday gathering. Nothing luxurious, just food, drinks, and people he grew up with. One of the dishes prepared that day was Ramon's favorite, papaitan. According to his friends, he always asked for it during gatherings because it reminded him of home and family celebrations growing up. The dish is known for its strong, bitter flavor, traditionally made using goat meat, organs, and broth prepared from parts of the intestine. And honestly, while researching this case, I realized papaitan is one of those foods people either love immediately or completely avoid. But for the people who grew up eating it, the bitterness is the whole point. It's not supposed to taste clean or mild. That strong flavor is what makes it feel authentic. That afternoon, the goat was slaughtered and cleaned behind the house, while relatives arranged tables and drinks outside. But guests started arriving earlier than expected, and the cooking process became rushed. The intestines, which needed careful cleaning before cooking, were washed quickly, so the food could be served on time. Not carelessly on purpose, just rushed. Some of the waste material inside the intestines wasn't fully removed, and during preparation, contaminated liquid came into contact with the meat and broth. The papaitan was then cooked in a large metal pot over an outdoor wood fire. From the outside, it looked fully cooked. Steam rolled constantly from the pot, and people nearby could smell it long before dinner started. But later, the cook admitted the heat underneath wasn't consistent. One side of the pot stayed at a rolling boil, while another side only simmered lightly. And honestly, this part really stood out to me because most people judge food by how it looks. If it's steaming and smells cooked, people assume it's safe. But bacteria doesn't care if the top looks done when parts of the food never actually get hot enough. By early evening, bowls of papaitan were passed around to nearly 20 guests. At first, the mood stayed normal. People joked about how bitter it tasted, which is expected with papaitan anyway. Some added extra rice to soften the flavor, while others laughed about how strong the broth was compared to previous gatherings. Then, the first guest complained about stomach pain. Not severe at first, just enough to mention casually. A man near the drinks table said the food suddenly felt too heavy, while another guest blamed the beer and laughed it off. But about 20 minutes later, someone started vomiting beside the house. More people became sick, almost one after another. One woman sat quietly sweating through her shirt despite the cool air, while another guest rushed toward the roadside ditch to vomit. Children started crying from stomach cramps, and once the diarrhea spread through multiple tables at the same time, the gathering lost control quickly. By late evening, guests were bent over chairs, benches, and the ground, too weak to stand properly. Relatives moved between people carrying towels, water, and buckets, while Ramon sat near the center table drenched in sweat, unable to keep water down without vomiting again. I think that's the disturbing part here. Nobody saw a disaster coming because there wasn't one dramatic moment, just person after person quietly getting worse until the entire celebration turned into panic. By midnight, families were transporting victims to nearby clinics using tricycles, motorcycles, and private vehicles because there weren't enough ambulances. The small clinic quickly became overwhelmed as patients arrived with severe vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. Some, including Ramon, were later transferred to a larger hospital farther away. But by then, the infection had already spread in several patients. Blood pressure dropped, organs began failing, and over the next 1 to 2 days, 7 people died. Doctors later confirmed that multiple victims developed septic shock, where the infection overwhelmed the body completely. Ramon was among the last to die. After the investigation, the cause became clear. Lab testing found high levels of dangerous bacteria commonly found inside animal intestines. Investigators concluded the contamination happened during preparation, when the intestines weren't cleaned thoroughly enough before cooking. And because the heat inside the pot remained uneven, parts of the dish never became hot enough to fully destroy the bacteria before it was served. It was August 20th, 2017, and a billionaire's private retreat high in the Colorado Rockies was hosting a small dinner gathering after a day of outdoor activities. Surrounded by rugged mountain terrain and located more than an hour from the nearest town, the property offered guests both privacy and isolation. Zodny Berenger was 46 years old and had built a fortune through investments and business acquisitions over several decades. Known for his active lifestyle, he spent much of his free time traveling, skiing, and exploring the outdoors. The retreat was one of several private properties he used to host family members, close friends, and business associates throughout the year. The dinner itself was intended to be informal. Rather than a large banquet, guests gathered around a long wooden table overlooking the mountains as chefs prepared several courses using locally sourced ingredients. Much of the evening centered around fresh game, seasonal vegetables, and specialty foods sourced specifically for the retreat. As part of the evening's menu, guests were served pufferfish, a delicacy prized in some parts of the world, but infamous for requiring meticulous preparation before it can be eaten safely. Honestly, I probably would have tried it too. I mean, how often do you get a chance to eat something like that? As the evening continued, guests moved comfortably between dinner and conversation. Plates were cleared, drinks were refilled, and the atmosphere remained relaxed. Shortly after 8:30 p.m., the featured dish was served. I imagine the anticipation made that first bite even better. Zodny was among the first people to try the dish. For several minutes, nothing seemed unusual. Then, he noticed a tingling sensation around his lips and tongue. He took a sip of water and continued eating, expecting the sensation to pass. Instead, the tingling gradually spread through his mouth and jaw. When he tried speaking a few minutes later, his words sounded slightly slurred. The numbness continued worsening, making it increasingly difficult to speak clearly. Within minutes, Zodny noticed weakness developing in his hands. He struggled to maintain his grip on a drinking glass and eventually set it down after nearly dropping it. The weakness soon spread into his arms, and tasks that had felt effortless moments earlier suddenly required concentration. As the symptoms continued progressing, his breathing became noticeably more difficult. Each breath felt shallower than the last, and he began focusing entirely on drawing air into his lungs. What had started as a mild, tingling sensation was now rapidly affecting his ability to speak, move, and breathe normally. Emergency assistance was called immediately, but the retreat's remote mountain location created a significant challenge. I suppose that's the trade-off with places like that. The isolation is part of the appeal, right up until you need help in a hurry. Cellular reception in the area was limited, forcing several people to move around the property searching for a stable signal, while others remained with Zodny. As they waited, his condition continued deteriorating. He became increasingly weak and less responsive, eventually losing consciousness. By the time responders reached the retreat, a substantial amount of time had already passed. Zodny was transported for emergency treatment, but despite continued medical efforts, he died later that evening. Investigators later focused on the pufferfish served during dinner. Testing confirmed the presence of tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin naturally found in certain parts of the fish. The investigation revealed that a critical step used to remove toxin-bearing tissues had been performed incorrectly during preparation, allowing dangerous levels of tetrodotoxin to remain in portions of the final dish. The final report concluded that Zodny died from acute tetrodotoxin poisoning after consuming the improperly prepared pufferfish. Investigators determined that the preparation error had gone unnoticed before service, and the death was ruled accidental. It was November 14th, 2017, inside a late-night conveyor sushi bar in Osaka, Japan. Students filled the narrow room after classes, coats draped over stools. Plates moved steadily along the belt, tea steamed quietly, and conversations overlapped. Staff worked routinely, refilling dishes, clearing stacks, and keeping the pace even steady. One of the diner that evening was Keiko Mori, 23 years old, and nearing the end of her hospitality studies, balancing classes with part-time shifts at a budget hotel where she rotated between the front desk and breakfast service. She saved carefully for overseas internships and rarely missed a shift. She was dependable, detail-focused, and quietly competitive, someone who struggled with backing out once attention turned her way. Friends saw her as capable, but easily embarrassed, especially in public situations. She had been diagnosed with mild asthma as a child, mostly triggered by cold air or strong odors. Over time, the symptoms faded enough that she stopped carrying her inhaler regularly. In school, she was trained to stay calm under pressure, to maintain a pleasant expression regardless of discomfort. She took pride in managing situations without showing distress, particularly in settings where being watched mattered. The sushi bar she visited that night was known locally for informal food challenges. They weren't posted on menus, but staff tolerated them as long as things stayed lighthearted. One involved eating a golf ball-sized lump of pure wasabi, far stronger than what accompanied sushi plates. It was freshly grated and kept covered to maintain its strength. Employees knew it caused coughing and tearing, but assumed adults understood the limits. That evening, the restaurant was crowded and loud, with diners filming short clips of food and reactions. Keiko's friends brought up the challenge casually while scrolling on their phones. A phone was set up to record before she agreed. A staff member glanced over, saw laughter, and a phone pointed toward the counter, and moved on. No warnings were offered, and no one intervened. Keiko paused for a moment, then lifted the wasabi and swallowed it in one motion. Almost immediately, her face changed. Her eyes widened and filled with tears. She opened her mouth to breathe in, but nothing came through. A reflexive spasm closed the muscles at the top of her airway, locking it without any gradual warning. She grabbed at her neck, knocking plates off the counter. No sound came out, not even a cough. Her face flushed dark red, then began to purple. Tears ran down her cheeks as she leaned forward, chest rising sharply but pulling in no air. People nearby laughed at first, assuming she was exaggerating for the recording. Her lips darkened. Her hands shook, then lost strength. She slid off the stool and collapsed onto the tiled floor. She was still conscious, eyes open, but unable to draw a breath. The second recording, started moments earlier by another diner, captured her movements slowing, then stopping entirely. Confusion spread as people argued whether it was a prank or panic reaction. Emergency services were called once it was clear Keiko was not recovering. Staff repositioned her, but did not clear her airway. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found no pulse. Resuscitation continued during transport, but she was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. The post-mortem showed no obstruction, allergy, or toxin. Her airway was clear. The cause of death was acute laryngospasm triggered by exposure to concentrated wasabi during ingestion. Panic and underlying asthma prevented the airway from reopening, leading to rapid oxygen deprivation and cardiac failure. The restaurant was cited and barred from food challenges. Staff underwent emergency training. Her school later added airway response awareness to its curriculum. It was July 21st, 2016, and the late afternoon heat in Orlando pressed down on the crowded walkways of a popular entertainment district. The sun hung low, casting long shadows between the buildings and storefronts lining the pedestrian area. Tourists moved in steady streams, carrying shopping bags and stopping to photograph street performers. The air smelled of fried food, sunscreen, and the faint sweetness of dessert vendors competing for attention. Matt Park, a 26-year-old employee at a nearby theme park, had finished his shift and was walking through the district with two co-workers. Known among friends as a thrill seeker, he gravitated toward new experiences and rarely hesitated to try something unusual. He worked in operations, managing crowds and ensuring ride safety. After clocking out, the group decided to explore the area and grab something to eat before heading home. They passed several stalls before stopping at a vendor selling novelty desserts, flash frozen with liquid nitrogen. The display case showed colorful treats surrounded by billowing white vapor spilling over the edges and drifting toward the ground. A small sign warned customers to wait until all visible vapor had dissipated before consuming the product. The vendor briefly explained that the desserts were extremely cold and needed a moment to stabilize after purchase. Matt ordered a larger item, a sphere of frozen cream coated in candy pieces. It was handed to him in a small paper cup, vapor still pouring off the surface. One co-worker pulled out a phone to record him trying it. Without waiting, Matt lifted the dessert from the cup and bit into it immediately. The outer layer cracked, but the interior still held pockets of liquid nitrogen that had not fully evaporated. He chewed quickly and swallowed a large frozen chunk while walking away. Moments later, his expression shifted. He slowed, then stopped, pressing a hand to his stomach as a sharp, deep pain spread through his abdomen. The trapped nitrogen warmed inside him, expanding into gas and causing severe internal stress. Matt bent forward, breathing hard, as the discomfort intensified into something far worse than simple stomach cramps. He tried to speak, but managed only a strained gasp. His co-workers hurried toward him. He lowered to one knee, gripping his midsection as the pain escalated and nausea set in. Within another minute, he collapsed onto his side, curling inward. His skin turned pale, sweat forming across his forehead as his breathing grew rapid and shallow. One co-worker called emergency services while the other knelt beside him, urging him to stay awake. A small crowd gathered as his responsiveness faded and his eyes struggled to stay focused. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. They found him semi-conscious and in clear distress, showing signs of shock and severe abdominal injury. His abdomen was rigid and extremely tender. They initiated emergency protocols, placed him on oxygen, and transported him rapidly to a nearby hospital. During transport, his vital signs continued to deteriorate despite intervention. At the hospital, doctors rushed him for emergency imaging. By the time he reached the trauma unit, scans revealed a gastric perforation with internal bleeding and free air in the abdominal cavity, likely caused by expanding gas from ingested liquid nitrogen. Surgeons attempted emergency repair, but the extent of the internal damage and blood loss proved catastrophic. Matt was pronounced dead approximately 90 minutes after consuming the dessert. The autopsy confirmed death resulted from gastric perforation and hemorrhagic shock linked to ingestion of incompletely stabilized nitrogen-frozen food. Examination of dessert remnants recovered from the scene showed parts of the interior still contained liquid nitrogen at the time of consumption. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as internal perforation and exsanguination due to ingestion of improperly stabilized cryogenic food. The vendor was temporarily shut down, pending investigation. Authorities reviewed witness statements and footage showing him consuming the dessert before the vapor dissipated. The incident was classified as an accidental death resulting from premature consumption of a cryogenically prepared food product. It was July 9, 2018, at a working marina along the Biloxi waterfront in Mississippi. Fishing boats were returning to the docks after the morning catch, while workers moved along the pier unloading coolers of seafood and preparing equipment for sorting and cleaning. Christy Bluff was 29 and had only recently started working at the marina. Her job involved unloading seafood from incoming boats, hosing down decks, and sorting the catch into bins for local buyers. Having grown up away from the commercial fishing industry, she was still learning many of the routines that experienced dock workers treated as everyday knowledge. Co-workers described her as friendly and curious, often asking questions about the different types of seafood that came through the docks. Around mid-morning, a fisherman returned hauling a cooler filled with reef catch. Inside was a large crab with a dark, mottled shell measuring roughly 10 inches across. The crew referred to it casually as a devil crab, a dockside nickname used for certain large reef crabs pulled from offshore structures. The crab had been caught earlier that morning and packed on ice during the return trip. When the cooler was open near the cleaning tables, Christy asked if she could try cooking it. Several co-workers told her that people sometimes boiled fresh crab on the dock during slow periods. Assuming she understood the basic preparation, no one stepped in to supervise. A portable propane burner was set on a workbench near the cleaning station, and a large aluminum pot was filled with water from a dock hose. Christy lit the burner and waited for the water to boil before dropping the crab into the pot. After several minutes, the shell turned bright red. She lifted it out with metal tongs and set it on the table to cool. Once the shell was cool enough to handle, Christy cracked it open with a seafood mallet. The crab had not been cleaned before cooking, and its digestive organs remained inside the body cavity. Unaware of the risk, she pulled pieces of meat from the shell and began eating them directly from the crab. About 20 minutes later, Christy mentioned that her lips felt strange. She rubbed them with the back of her hand and told a co-worker that her mouth felt numb and her fingertips were tingling. At first, some assumed she had simply burned her tongue on the hot crab. Within minutes, however, Christy leaned forward against the table and said she felt weak and dizzy. Co-workers noticed her speech beginning to sound slurred as she gripped the edge of the table for support. The numbness appeared to spread through her hands and arms, and her breathing became shallow and uneven. When she tried to step away from the table, her legs suddenly gave out. She collapsed onto the dock beside the burner as nearby workers rushed toward her. One worker ran toward the marina office to call emergency services, while another stayed beside Christy and tried to keep her airway open. Her muscles continued to weaken, and she struggled to respond to people speaking to her. Within minutes, she became largely unresponsive, while co-workers waited for paramedics to arrive. Emergency personnel arrived within 12 minutes and began administering aid on the dock before loading her onto a stretcher. She was transported to a nearby hospital as her breathing continued to deteriorate, but she did not regain consciousness during transport. Investigators later collected the remaining crab shell and uneaten meat from the marina. Laboratory analysis confirmed paralytic shellfish toxins concentrated in the crab's digestive organs, which can contaminate nearby meat if cooked intact and are not destroyed by boiling. Officials concluded that Christy had consumed contaminated meat, with symptoms of paralytic shellfish poisoning appearing roughly 20 minutes later and progressing to respiratory failure. The death was ruled accidental poisoning caused by improperly cleaned shellfish. It was March 3, 2016 in Bangkok, Thailand, just above a busy stretch of Yaowarat Road. The second-floor eatery looked normal. Narrow tables, cheap metal chairs, and a rusted railing between diners. And the street below. But the space was tighter than it should have been, and once Julian stood up, there was almost nowhere safe to move. Honestly, it's the kind of place you don't question until something goes wrong. Earlier that evening, Julian Hart was 34 from the UK. Traveling through Southeast Asia after picking up short-term construction jobs back home. He wasn't reckless in the obvious way, and he didn't go looking for risky situations, but he had one habit that mattered here. When something felt uncomfortable, he didn't stop. He pushed through it and assumed it would pass. By the time he sat down, that already mattered more than it should have. He had spent most of the afternoon walking in the heat without drinking much water, and people at the table later said he looked drained. His face was flushed, his breathing was heavier than usual, and his lips were dry. When the vendor offered water as they ordered, Julian waved it off and focused on the food instead. He ordered what everyone else was eating, grilled pork skewers coated in crushed bird's eye chili, still hot from the flame. It looked simple, and nothing about it suggested any kind of risk. The first bite hit immediately, and he started coughing. At first, it didn't seem serious, just the kind of reaction people have when something is too hot or too spicy. But the coughing didn't stop. It came in sharp bursts that forced him forward, and every time he tried to breathe in, the heat and spice triggered it again. Someone at the table told him to slow down, and another person pushed a glass of water toward him, but he didn't take it. Instead, he straightened up and took another bite, like he was trying to get through it faster and move on. That second bite made things worse. His breathing broke into short, uneven pulls between coughs, and his eyes started watering heavily. His face turned a deeper red, and for a moment, it still looked like something he could handle if he just got through it. Then, something changed. The coughing stopped helping, turning into shallow, strained breaths. People noticed he was trying to inhale through a partially blocked airway. When he reached for his throat, it was clear this wasn't just the spice anymore. A piece of meat had gone down the wrong way and hadn't cleared properly. It wasn't blocking his airway completely, but it was enough to interfere with how he was breathing. At the same time, the heat and chili had already irritated his airway, and that irritation made everything react faster. His throat began to swell, his cough weakened, and airflow became limited. His breathing grew more labored with each attempt. Someone moved to help, but he shifted away, still trying to manage it on his own. That delay made the difference. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table, trying to force a stronger cough, but nothing came up. His breathing grew louder and tighter, and a high-pitched sound started to come through when he tried to inhale. At that point, people around him were fully aware that something was seriously wrong. His body went from struggling to failing. He staggered slightly, then dropped to one knee as the strength in his legs gave out. Someone moved behind him to help, but there was confusion, with too many people reacting at once and no clear action happening fast enough. Because the airway wasn't completely blocked, it didn't look like a typical choking situation, and that made it harder for people to respond properly right away. Within seconds, he collapsed onto his side. The entire sequence, from the first cough to losing consciousness, took less than 2 minutes. Emergency services were called immediately, but traffic in the area slowed everything down, and it still took several minutes for responders to reach him. By the time they arrived, he was unresponsive. The forensic findings were clear. There was a partial airway obstruction caused by a piece of meat that had not cleared, combined with severe irritation from inhaling hot, chilly vapor. That irritation led to rapid swelling inside his throat, narrowing the airway until air could no longer pass through effectively. The investigation ruled it an accidental death caused by food-related airway obstruction, made worse by dehydration and the delay in responding to what was happening. Witnesses confirmed that he had been offered water and had multiple chances to stop eating when the first signs appeared. It was October 13th, 2018, in rural Finland, and the air around Grimfeld Lodge had already turned cold by evening. Smoke from an open fire pit drifted across the yard as guests gathered nearby with drinks and phones out, watching a whole roasted boar slowly turning above the flames. Mikael Roos was 41, a delivery driver who spent most of his days on the road between small towns. He wasn't used to places like this, private lodges, formal dinners, but his brother-in-law had invited him, and it felt like a rare break from routine. That night, the main attraction was a whole smoked boar turning slowly over an open fire. It had been cooking since early morning, held up by a motorized chain system above the pit. As the evening went on, the staff prepared to lower it for serving. Guests naturally moved closer. It was something people wanted to see up close, and honestly, I can understand why, because in a small event like this, the food becomes part of the entertainment too. Some guests stood only feet from the pit, recording on their phones, while others crowded near the serving tables. An older couple sat beside the fire to stay warm as kitchen helpers prepared trays nearby. Then one worker noticed the chain dragging slightly. It corrected itself, so nobody stopped the motor. Witnesses assumed the resistance came from heat or grease buildup. But as the boar was lowered, the weight shifted, and the upper chain link suddenly gave out, dropping the entire carcass into the fire pit. The impact forced burning embers and grease outward as hot fat spilled directly into the flames. But instead of a normal flare, the grease atomized in the heat, sending a fast-moving wave of fire across the cooking area. Burning liquid splashed onto clothing and skin, while the people closest to the pit had almost no time to react. One guest's sleeve caught fire instantly, another man burned his hands trying to pull someone away, and the crowded, uneven ground caused people to stumble into each other instead of escaping cleanly. Mikael was near the front because he had been helping his brother-in-law prepare the carving table. By the time the chain failed, he was only a few feet from the pit. He tried to step back, but there wasn't enough room once everyone moved at the same time. Some tripped over benches, while others tried pulling people away, using jackets and bare hands to smother the flames. One worker ran for a fire blanket as guests dragged the injured toward the driveway. The flare lasted only seconds, but some victims were still covered in burning grease and melted fabric even after the flames dropped. Emergency services were called right away, but because the lodge was in a rural area, it took time for help to arrive. In the meantime, staff and guests tried to move the injured away from the fire and keep them stable. Mikael and 5 others were taken to nearby hospitals. The doctors later confirmed that all 6 had suffered severe third-degree burns. Some had also inhaled superheated smoke and grease during the flare, which badly damaged their airways even before the burns themselves were fully treated. Over the next 1 to 3 days, complications set in, including fluid loss, shock, infection, and organ failure, and one by one, they didn't survive. The investigation later found that the chain had weakened from hours of heat and strain. But the real danger came when the boar fell and released burning grease directly into the fire, creating the deadly flare. After the incident, local officials pushed for stricter safety checks on outdoor cooking setups. But by then, 6 people were already dead from a fire that lasted only seconds.